Hey, Diane.
Radio.
Hey, Leslie.
Two Chicago reporters speaking on immigration and politics.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to Rabiosa Medina Radio. This is our fourth episode on Breaking the Silence with Maria Hinojosa.
So, for this episode, we're going to talk a lot about what's happening right now with the protest, the Black Lives Matter movement, and just asking this queen that we know, Maria Hinojosa, about her life. What was it like living through the 60s and the civil rights movement, and just like trying to be visible in a space that's all white when you're the only Latina in the newsroom. And I think that was the inspiration of why I wanted to get into broadcast. So it's been a crazy time. I know the last time we spoke, I was telling you about my experience and how I was almost hurt by police, and there was a lot of police brutality at the Chicago protest. And right now, what we're seeing in the media, especially like Telemundo and Univision, they're two Hispanic television networks. They have been just using footage of rioters and looters instead of showing the whole picture. And I think when our parents see that, that's what they're going to think. And they're not going to believe that the police are also perpetrators of violence. And we're seeing that. We're seeing journalists being attacked. We're seeing journalists being silenced, journalists being censored. And being out there is very dangerous. And yeah, I just wanted to know, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so it, it's like such a rocky time right now with the protests and COVID-19. It's like I'm I'm trying to be cautious of both now when I go outside. But I don't know, as a reporter, I recently applied for a Chicago Police Department press pass in hopes that it would make a difference, but I'm not too sure. So once I do have it, I can start reporting, hopefully with some identification, so I'm not really stopped. But as we see on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, reporters are constantly being shot with rubber bullets, being beaten up. Um, there's just
So
too many
bad.
videos out there,
Yeah, so
right?
many.
And yeah, and we even agreed if we want to go to protests, maybe we'll even go together to report, because just to have some person to be with, with me or you.
Yeah, just having protection. When I went, if I would have went by myself, that would have been really deadly. I'm
Yeah.
telling you, because it was not safe, even for like an innocent bystander who wasn't involved in chanting or protesting. You were still looked at, you were still targeted. And that's the scariest part, that if I haven't brought my friends to protect me, what would have happened to me? And I asked myself that many times. And I don't know, Diane, it like I have like an acute PTSD. So ever since that happened,
Mhm.
I've been having, like, I can hear sounds now. I freak out more. Like, I'm scared of going outside. I'm starting to feel like moments of sadness, where there's some times where I can't process what just happened. That curfew that Lori put a lot of people in danger, and it's still happening, by the way, that you can't go out. Like, if you're out there at 9, you're like, it's very dangerous if you're out there. So when she implemented that curfew at 9, it was 9. It was 9. So there was no way for people to go home. They were trapped. They were put in a trolley. And I don't know if you saw that video too, Diane, where two college students, I believe from Morehouse, you saw how they were pulled out of their car, and it was 9, or I don't know what time it was, but they were pulled out of their car by a police officer in the National Guard. They were tased.
There were
And
many cars in front of them, many. And these two
yes,
college students were not even protesting. They were just on their way home. and they did not do anything, and police came to their car and not just arrested them but pulled them out, broke their glass, tased them, choked them, abused them. It was really horrific to see this image, and I saw it all over Twitter. And I had, as much as I don't want to, contribute to trauma porn because of how many traumatic videos there are out there, I had to comment on that because that is just absurd.
There are many incidents that happen in Chicago where people were like police officers were putting their knee. There's a video of a police officer putting his knee on I believe it was a woman, or I'm not sure if it was a man. And after what happened to George Floyd, you're seeing like police officers using that as like a form of abusing their power, knowing that this happened to that man. And just it was insane, how that happened.
Yeah,
um it was unbelievable, it
it's
was.
either we're
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like we're seeing police officers either be sympathetic towards what's happening or completely against protesters. I mean, the other day, I think it was yesterday, there was like a van of Chicago Police Department, Chicago Police, and this dude who's a cop was like flicking off the protesters.
It took a whole, yeah, the whole world to join and protest and have like looting happening and fire burning in these buildings, and for people to pay attention. And it could have been done before. It could have been done. They could have increased his charge. They could have done immediate action that was not taken. And when COVID hit, you weren't seeing the National Guard here protecting people from this, halting the spread.
And you also didn't see a curfew or like they closed the transit and stopped the CTA, the buses and the trains just for the protest, but not to stop the virus. So yeah, it's a little
Oh
messed up.
yeah. Oh yeah. It's crazy, Diane.
I really hope this historic moment, this iconic moment in the nation and worldwide really does spark a true difference, like a difference from the roots, and changes people. And we're really excited to talk more about this with our guest for this episode, episode number 4. And so stay tuned.
So for today's episode, we have award-winning journalist Maria Hinojosa. She is an anchor and producer with NPR's Latino USA and a CEO of Futuro Media Group, the nonprofit media that she created. So we're very, very happy to have you. We know you're the first Latina ever to intern for NPR and to also anchor there. So it's a huge honor to interview you today.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. I was actually the first Latina to intern at NPR and to be hired at NPR
Wow.
ever. That was in the that was in the year 1985. So it was a long time ago.
And how was that, being the first Latina in a predominantly white space?
Yeah, what I understood is I understood that my discomfort was not more important than my responsibility. So that I realized that getting out of my comfort zone was something that I was able to do because I had privilege, and therefore if I had privilege, then I had to use it. And then I was like, well, I've got to be here representing. I mean, when people say represent now, it's like everybody kind of gets it. I'm trying to think back then if we would have said I'm representing, but that's what I understood.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I took that responsibility pretty seriously.
yeah, and it's very challenging when you're the only Latina in a newsroom and they're pushing some narratives and you know about what's happening to your people. Because my family, they're all immigrants, and I married an immigrant, and we're in the process of citizenship. So there's a lot of stories that are not told. And yeah, we just wanted to ask you more about being in these major media outlets like CNN, NPR, and now PBS. Yeah.
So, I think when you think about when I got in the business, so 1980s, um, it was print, radio, and television. That was it. Um, you could be a freelancer, but ultimately you were going to be feeding material into those mediums. So I didn't have much of a choice. I knew I could survive as an independent, as a freelancer for a certain amount of time, but that at some point I maybe was going to have to get on staff. And I feel like once I was there, first of all, it became demystified. I think a lot of, and it's okay for a young journalist to be like, oh my God, I'm going to step in, I'm going to work at NBC News or, CNN or any of these places. But then you have to realize that the people who are working there are not superhumans. They're not brilliant just because. And so then you begin to understand that you're as smart as everybody else. Actually, you're probably smarter because you have a lot more complex world experience. And then you understand that part of what you have to do, in my view, as a good journalist, is to bring that into the newsroom. And
Yeah.
so always be, raising your hand with an idea. What about this? What about this? What about this? Like, I think that's the job. Part of our job is to always be pushing ideas in different ways, to look at things in different stories, that as journalists, we have to cultivate our natural curiosity.
Yeah.
And not walk away from those questions that we have, but rather really spend some time with the questions that we have, because usually they're really smart, good questions.
They are. Yeah. And sometimes we feel like we're not heard, and it's hard to push or pitch a story. Um, and right now we're seeing that. We're seeing the news, and what I saw protesting in Chicago was not what I saw on TV, because I was hurt by a police officer. And so you're seeing a lot of journalists of color, they're getting attacked, they're getting hurt. And it's something that you're just not seeing. So I just wanted to know, how can we push um, the real reality of what we're facing?
I
Yeah.
mean, I think you have to be putting it out there. Like, I think about the fact that, we did, and not everybody had cameras and cell phone videos in the 1960s. So there was a lot of the things that we saw happening now. For example, George Floyd being killed and
Yeah.
captured on tape. Also, people committing acts of vandalism who were not part of the protests, not part of the community. Also, the police instigating the violence.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things are not new,
Hmm. Yeah.
especially in a city like Chicago.
Oh.
I mean, I was alive during 1968. I don't remember much, but I was alive on the south side of Chicago. So these things are not new. At least now we are able to see them. And I think it is our responsibility. And thank you for your work as a journalist covering these historic moments and this uprising of our voices.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I really commend journalists who are doing this work right now, especially because we are being attacked. That is part of the story that is not being told, is that journalists, specifically journalists of color, are being attacked. And that is part of the story.
Yeah, most definitely. And speaking about the 60s and living in Hyde Park, what were some things that you saw? I know you lived through the civil rights movement, and would you consider this a civil rights movement or something that's more modernized, or what do you think is happening right now, and what's your stance?
It's weird because I don't like to make these comparisons, but it really, even the Women's March, which was an international mobilization like we had never seen before, internationally. Even the Women's March, which was massive, pales in comparison to what we've just been witnessing over these past few days, over a week now. You know, it is a movement of people. Absolutely, it is a movement of people. I'm now at the point where I'm prepared to be hearing from people who are participating, as well as our colleagues in the media. You know, what is the plan? What do people want? Defunding the police, what does that look like? You know, I'm interested in now more specifics about what the protest movement wants so that it can become a more defined movement. And I think actually Black Lives Matter has a 10-point plan. It's just that I kind of like to see that more front and center now, so that everybody can see more about the plan of action. But I think this is just like 1968. If you know, in that sense of something that is transformative, where lives will be forever changed. Some of them in positive ways, like people getting woke and people making decisions about, I am going to do something. Latinos and Latinas specifically making connections to understanding and respecting Black lives, understanding the history of anti-Blackness around the world, in this country, in Latin America, among our own people and families, anti-Blackness. How do we discuss this? So, so this is transformative.
Yeah.
And we are in the middle of a pandemic. So absolutely, this is like something we have never witnessed before. It is absolutely historic, earth-shattering, and changing people. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, oh, Diane, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, you know, like speaking of media and all of that, you know, as journalists, we're taught if it bleeds, it leads. But there's also stories that we shouldn't be highlighting more than the human stories. For example, I think looting and rioting has been the highlight topic of so many media outlets, but we should really be maybe focusing more on the human stories of the protesters, of them individually, what they're going through. So what do you think, what stance should journalists be taking during this time?
We have to speak up. So what we just lived through right now is something actually very specifically like today, the day that we're recording this show. The New York Times actually backtracked and said that they published an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton, where he basically was saying, call in the troops, call in the military to stop the protests. And Black journalists at the New York Times on social media started saying, how can you print this at a time when our lives are already in danger? And and so there was a movement of journalists through social media to push the New York Times, and they responded. They pulled the article, and they look sadly ridiculous, because I really want the New York Times to be better all the time. We need to be able to trust our you know, our legacy news organizations. So unfortunately, they come out with a lot of egg on their face. They should have never published that. You know, they said it was a rushed editing process, and I'm a little bit like, I want to be published in the New York Times with a rushed editing process.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking about that, it's been really hard to be vocal on these issues. I know it's frowned upon to not stay neutral, to not speak out, to not say, hey, this is wrong what happened. This is what I saw. And I think this is something that's been conflicting us, and we feel ashamed sometimes because we're like, oh, was that the wrong thing to do? Oh my God, I shouldn't have said that. Or sometimes you're just like, no, I have to do this because as a journalist of color, Diane is from Lebanon, and I'm Mexican American. I feel like it's almost like a right to speak out and to voice our yeah.
So we supposedly, you know, my parents people's families made the decision to come to this country because of many reasons, and it's complicated, but certainly one of the things we knew about this country was that there's freedom of speech.
Yeah.
Whether from Lebanon or from Mexico, our families understood that there was this basic thing, that in the United States there was freedom of speech. So I think it's our responsibility right now.
It is.
What does that freedom of speech look like? What does that that takes different shapes and forms. And so whenever people, when I used to travel across the country and people would say, well, what should I do? What should we do? You talk about this. What should we do? And I was like, you know what? You can figure it out. You can actually figure out what to do. I don't have to tell you. You're smart enough. So I really feel like this is a moment where I hope everybody recognizes and does something individually to change or to add. That's going to be an extraordinary legacy that we will, never forget, that during the pandemic, we also stepped up for humanity.
Yeah, and speaking about the pandemic, I know that you recently contracted the virus, and I was like, oh no. And what was that like? What were things that you experienced while having that? I felt so bad. I was like, no.
We're very
Yeah.
glad
What
you're
happened?
healthy and well now.
Oh,
So
thank
glad
you,
you're
sweetie.
okay.
Thank you. I was in hotspots just before everything shut down. So I was actually in Detroit, Chicago, Tucson, and Los Angeles, and then New York. And then we closed down our office. And we now know that there were a couple of people in my office that were infected. So we're so glad that we shut down earlier enough. I don't know if I ended up getting infected in the office or whether I was in LA, or I don't know. But I know that the first thing was that I went into a lot of denial. I just didn't want to believe that I could have this. I didn't get tested because I was just too sick to go out and get tested. And then about almost 3 weeks now, I guess, I went and I had the antibody test and it came out positive. So, and I know I was sick, so I know I had it. I'm not one of those people that gets sick. I don't even get the flu. So I became very public about this because I wanted to actually let people know that you could survive this. I wanted to let people know that I was kind of documenting this very intimate experience about being sick. Also, I didn't want people to worry about me. I was sick, but I didn't want people to be thinking I was dying. So I was like, I'm eating my chicken soup, you guys. And what ended up happening is that actually, I think for this virus, it really is a war. You are in a war with this virus. Your body is in a war with this virus. And so the positive feedback that I got from posting wherever I was posting actually was really important. And people were getting in touch with me, people who were survivors themselves, who were saying, you got this. And then I realized that when other people, like my former student from DePaul, Laura Rodriguez, got infected and got sick, then I was in touch with her and kind of giving her the positive. So I am really thankful every day that I'm alive.
Yeah, we're grateful that
That's
you're
how I
alive
feel.
too. Yeah, we're so happy you're okay, and it's been a battle, especially for Latinos, contracting this virus. It's very hard. I know people that have lost their loved ones because of COVID, and yeah, my mom is also at risk. She has diabetes, and it's been really weird. And every day, Latinos and especially African Americans, they're at most risk. At most, they're at
African
risk. Yeah.
American men and Latino men
Yeah.
Are most at risk.
they're the ones who are dying at the highest numbers. So it's African American overwhelmingly, then Latino. But it's of both of those groups, it's the men mostly, which is what's really hard. And we actually did a story about this for Latino USA because I wanted to understand who, you know, people at first thought that this was the Tom Hanks sickness.
Yeah,
People
it's
thought
not.
that it was the Idris Elba sickness. It was the illness of the super rich who could travel. And in fact, in the ICUs, the people who are there are mostly African American and Latinos who are fighting for their lives. And so that was the story that I wanted to. So we went inside an ICU with a doctor who was describing for me what she was seeing, because we have to humanize this story. It's not just over 100,000 lives. It's
Mhm.
who are those lives? So yeah, I'm it feels pretty crazy, but I'm a survivor.
Yeah,
I'm a
very,
survivor.
very happy for you, Maria. So happy. It's a blessing, honestly.
Yeah,
But yeah.
it's scary to, but it's good that you are happy and healthy now and all of that. And in Chicago, it's not just a regional level where Latinos and African American men are, or the community in general is being affected, but it's also national. And in the midst of the pandemic and in the midst of the protests, um, everyone's really being affected. And earlier you mentioned freedom of speech for citizens. And, something also in the United States, we're pros freedom of the press as well, but the press are being affected. And multiple videos out there on the internet and on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook about reporters being attacked by the police. And so we want to ask you, does having a police, there's two types of press passes, I'm guessing. There's one that's the regular press pass, and then there's the one that's the police department press pass. And I recently applied to the Chicago Police Department press pass. Do you think it's going to make a difference? Do you think it'll improve anything?
It's interesting because we just applied. I used to have a New York City Police, an NYPD press pass for decades. And then I just wasn't using it. And we are trying to apply for the press passes. And it's a good question. Does it make you more of a target or less?
Yeah.
I think what we have to realize, which is really challenging for us, is that when you have a president who repeats over and over again that we are the enemy of the people, I'm not surprised. It's just very hurtful to think that there are people within the police department, whether it's Chicago or here or in LA or wherever, that feel
Yeah.
like that we should be the target. That for me is just like, it feels very confusing to know that there are people who are within these institutions that have guns and
Yeah.
batons,
Oh,
and that they think that. But why wouldn't they think that it's okay to attack a journalist? You have a president who says we are liars and the enemy of the people, and that we are scum.
yeah, we were learning about that in our class, and how do we like ask questions when we're censored? We can't, like Jorge Ramos. I know you spoke about that on MSNBC, how he was just singled out and he wasn't able to continue his question. I've been seeing a lot of that, like with Peter Alexander from NBC. He asked him, a lot of people are dying. What can you tell? Like, I think it was around based on that, but it's just something I've been seeing, and it's been hard to be out there and
Yeah.
ask questions.
So you keep asking. I know that it's hard as a younger journalist, but I'm thinking about the fact that when I was a younger journalist and there were protests in Washington Heights, right here, after the NYPD had killed a man, Kike Garcia, I think was his name,
Mm.
and the police killed him. And then there were very intense uprising in Washington Heights, the Dominican neighborhood. And how the mayor at the time, the first Black mayor, didn't appreciate the fact that I was always prodding him. That's my job. Now when I talk to that mayor Dinkins is probably 92 now. He always says you did the right thing. I mean, and he really didn't like me, and he didn't like the press, but he understood that we were doing our job. So I think that's what's really important to understand, is that is our job. That is our profession. That is what we do. And as women of color, it's particularly challenging, right? Because we don't want to be seen as angry women. So sometimes what we do is we can use who we are as a way to disarm people. Like the fact that I'm only 5 feet tall. People are like, oh, she couldn't be that mean, that tough.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And it's like you're small, but you're not, because you have a voice and can say things. And yeah. So
I was just going to ask so there's a difference between obviously the corporation media and then community media, and, just so many different outlets that share stories, journalism. Do you think it's changing? Do you think corporate media is changing and is focusing more on the people, or does it still depend? And what do you think about the future of journalism?
I'm going to be hopeful here. I'm just going to be hopeful and say that actually in a moment like this, living through the protests and through the pandemic, that more young people will understand and become committed to the profession of journalism. And that as a result, it's going to get better. I have to say, there has been some kind of phenomenal journalism that has been reported throughout the pandemic. And through now, I would include the reporting that Latino USA and In the Thick and Latino Rebels has done as part of it.
Yes,
and we're all
Rebels.
Right, and we're independent. Like we're independent, but we do this work. So I don't think journalism is going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I hope that actually, that as a result of this, that more young people actually say, wow, I need to do this, and fall in love with journalism, because they ended up maybe covering this story for their Instagram, but then they realize that this is they've fallen in love with the profession. So I'm very hopeful, but also tengo los pies en la tierra. And this is a very frightening time for journalists everywhere. And so we have to also open our eyes and see what has happened in our country.
Yeah.
Yes. So speaking about journalism, I wanted to ask you, who were your influences? Was it your father? I know you also spoke about MLK and just other people that helped you be who you are today. And just wanted to ask you, what made you come out of that comfort zone and say, I'm not invisible anymore. I'm visible and I'm heard and I'm seen?
As you were asking that, I was like, what was it? And I was like, oh, it was because I was the youngest of 4. And that I always felt like I had to be, no, pero yo. No, I actually think it was my mom, who is, smaller than 5 feet tall. And I think she understood like what the United States of America stood for writ large. And so she communicated that to us. My father left his greatest gift to me, may he rest in peace, was his passion. He was a nerd. He was a scientist nerd who wanted to help solve deafness. Mm-hmm. And so he helped to create the cochlear implant.
Oh,
it was
wow.
So it was his passion. And so my passion for my profession, understanding mission, is what my father gave me. But yeah, when you mentioned Martin Luther King, I was formed as a conscious, at that time I wasn't American, I had a green card, but as a conscious young person through the civil rights era with Martin Luther King. He was my guide. And all of that is here, actually. Because what I end
Can
up
you
doing in this book is that I end up giving my own kind of place in history, but then it's also an opportunity to talk about policy. So people are like, oh my God, what a juicy memoir. But actually, there's a lot of spinach in this memoir, but it's like good spinach made with like garlic and olive oil. And that is what you come away with with when you read this book. That will be out September 15th. Once I was you, I beat you to the pen, to the punch.
May I ask
can you
what?
tell me? Oh,
Oh,
Diane,
sorry.
it's okay. Go ahead,
Yeah, if you
Diane.
could just tell us, like, what drove you to write this book, publish it, and the message behind it.
Yeah. So actually, I hadn't written a book since my memoir, Raising Raul, where I talked about becoming a mom. And I mean, I was just busy being a mom, launching a career, launching a company. And then in 2015, 2016, I was on MSNBC, and I had a moment where I went viral, actually, because I took somebody on, Steve Cortez, actually, who used the term illegal alien, illegal immigrant. And I just, I went off on him, and that became viral. And a very good friend of mine just said, you need to write the book. You need to write the book. Illegal is not a noun. You need to write that book right now. And I was like, yeah, probably. And so I thought I was going to write a little tiny book, like a little pocket book, like why you should never use the term illegal. That was the original idea. And then, when you get involved in writing a book, and you actually have to find an agent. My agent had retired, so I had to find an agent. You have to actually try to get a publishing company to be interested. And all of that happened. It took quite a while, but I ended up with an amazing agent. Her name is Adriana Dominguez. And we ended up taking this book to Michelle Herrera Mulligan, who is an amazing editor at that's Raul from Raising Raul. So she's an amazing editor at Simon & Schuster imprint of Atria. And so this book became more than just my story, and I'm so happy. It's really about journalism, immigration policy, being a woman, an American woman, my identity, struggle, issue, battles, and then also it turns out that I actually end up writing about being a rape survivor. My rape occurred in Mexico, and so there's a lot of things that we don't talk about that come out in this book.
You're so powerful. I just had to tell you that. So, so powerful.
Thank
And
you.
much. And there's so many stories of those that you just said. And I'm just glad you're alive and you're confident, and you are, like, many consider you the queen of Latinx journalism. So
Really,
You
do you
are.
guys talk about seriously? Because like I'm at home right now. My son is back there. As you can see, things are moving behind me. My husband is working here. He's an artist. He's the painter. I live a pretty low-key life, I would say. I used to travel a lot, but I don't really go and hang out except for when I'm doing work things. And so, when people say, oh no, you're the queen or you're the icon, and I'm like, I'm barefoot. I don't see myself like that at all. I love it. I'm like, what is that? I don't even know what that is, because I'm like, I didn't have that when I was young like you. So I'm like, well, I think that's really cool if you guys can be just like, oh my God, like her. Then I guess, my work is done, because I didn't have that. And I did think like, well, I would just like to maybe inspire somebody else. And so purposefully said my name, Maria Hinojosa, when I was on radio, purposefully left my hair long and curly and wild when I was reporting at CNN, purposefully, wearing big ass, Mexican earrings, and because I wanted to say, no, I am not like everybody else. Can you handle it? But I'm a professional. I'm a journalist. And so if young people in general, Latinas and Latinos, see me in any way, shape, or form as some kind of a role model or the queen of or the icon, I'm like, pues que chulo. Yeah. What I don't want them to ever imagine is like, oh, but I could never talk to her, or I could never hang out with her, or I could never, just because I'm pretty chill.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really you're iconic, and honestly you've really inspired us, and Leslie has a lot of inspiration from you, and so we're very thankful, and thank you so much for coming on here and talking to us, and we're very excited even to read the book when it comes out
Oh
in
yeah,
September.
definitely.
Well, before we leave, I just want to say that I think it's great that Diane is from Lebanon or Lebanese descent, and you're Mexican, Leslie, me imagino.
Yes. Sí.
So my one of my family's closest friends were Mexican Lebanese.
Oh wow.
That's the reason behind our name, actually. Rabiosa
Yeah.
Medina, Arabic and Spanish.
Yeah, it was La Familia Bardawil, and they are still in Chicago, and they were our closest friends, Libanesos de Mexicanos. So there is a beautiful connection, and I love that you're doing this together. And thank you so much for this opportunity. And we can do it again in September when the book comes out.
Yes.
So that we can give it even more publicity. I'm committed to making this a bestseller, so everybody's got to buy at least one or two or
Everyone's
three or four
talking about
copies.
it. We can't wait.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much.
You.
We love you.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to episode 4, Breaking the Silence with Maria Hinojosa. It was amazing having this iconic journalist, award-winning journalist here with us on today's episode. We learned a lot, and me and Leslie are really excited to read her book that comes out in September. And to learn more about Maria Hinojosa, you can follow her on Twitter at Maria_Hinojosa or on Instagram at Maria_la_Hinojosa.
Yeah, and you can also check Hinojosa's work at Latino USA and see current episodes on what's happening. So yeah, it was great. Everything was great, and we'll be talking again soon.
Yes, and thank you for 20 Elbridge for the cover music and Arte Triste for the cover art.
Thank you guys. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Besos.